This is the fourth week that Swamiji takes a reading from the Gospel of St. John, which I mentioned week one. He says is the most spiritual gospel actually teaching in the Bible. And it is, of course, incredibly profound. The first week we talked about the vibration, sound manifesting, the vibration of consciousness manifesting as sound, that of course being Om. The next week was, does God create the universe or become it? God manifesting that divine consciousness into everything we see, know, think. Last week we talked about light in a different way. We did talk about the light coming and becoming everything, illuminating everything. And this week, of course, he's talking about how almost virtually impossible it is for man to see that. In fact, let me just start with this reading from the autobiography of a yogi, which just shows what we're up against. This is Sri Yukteswar speaking to Paramahansa Yogananda, and he says, Babaji's spiritual state is beyond human comprehension. Now, he's speaking about Babaji, but of course, Babaji is just a pure manifestation of sound, light, the divine energy, everything we're talking about, as are all other avatars. And he says, the dwarfed vision of men cannot pierce his transcendental star. One attempts in vain even to picture the avatar's attainment. He says, it is inconceivable. So he tells us pretty right out, this is virtually impossible from the human perspective for us to be able to begin to experience or realize from here who these great masters are. I'd like to start, this is the only part of today's sermon that has me nervous. In fact, I have notes on it. I want to tell you a joke. I know, it's true, this is crazy. I may actually need to refer to my notes. Only because it's a long joke for any of you who watched the minister's retreat yesterday up at Ananda Village. You heard this, because Jyotish told this joke, but it was just so perfect for today. So the reason I may need my notes, which I'm gonna grab, are not only because it's long, but there's a few very Catholic things in here, and I don't remember what they are. So last night I was thinking of telling this joke, and I thought, I should just say to Lakshmi, who assured me that she knew the joke, would you just step up here and tell the joke? But I'm gonna try, and if I get into too much trouble, we'll call her up. So, I'm actually not kidding. It is really good for this lesson, or I wouldn't be doing this to myself, never mind you. So, at the Vatican, suddenly this group of Sikhs starts surrounding the Vatican. They just come in groups and they're sitting outside of the Vatican. And the cardinals come in and they say to the Pope, we don't like this one bit. There are these Sikhs out there. We don't know who they are. They could be terrorists. They could be plotting any number of things against us. And we think that you should ask them to leave. And the Pope says, well, I can't really just ask them to leave. That just seems arbitrary and not right. And he said, but I have an idea. I'll challenge them to a theological debate. And of course, I'll win. And then when I win, as losers, they'll have to leave. So he calls the head of the Sikh group in, and he tells them that he'd like to have a theological debate with him. And the Sikh says, remember this is a joke, so it's not all logical. The Sikh says, how can we have a debate? I speak Punjabi, you speak Italian, we don't even understand each other, and we're gonna have a debate? That's just impossible. And the Pope says, you're right, let's do it in sign language. So the Sikh agrees to it, and so the Pope first takes his finger and he points up like this, and the Sikh goes, and the Pope is really surprised at that response. So he thinks, guy may be more than I thought. So the next thing the Pope does is he takes his hand and he circles around like this. I'm getting a thumbs up from Lakshmi. And the Sikh once again shakes his head like this, and the Pope thinks, wow, now I'm surprised and impressed. And the next thing the Pope goes and he gets a tray with the sacraments on it. So there's wine, there's bread, there's the host, and he shows it to the Sikh, and the Sikh goes into his backpack and he takes out an apple and he takes a bite of the apple. And the Pope is just amazed. And he says to the Sikh, you clearly have deserved the right to stay here. So he goes inside to the cardinals, and the cardinals say, well, what happened? And the Pope says, you won't believe it. He said, first I said, there's one God. And the Sikh says, let's not forget that God manifested in three forms as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And the Pope said, I was amazed. So then I said to him, God created the whole universe. And he said to me, and he also created the very ground that we're standing on. And the Pope said, I couldn't believe it. So I went and I got the sacraments and I brought them out and I was showing them to him. And he took out an apple and he took a bite of his apple, representing original sin, without which the sacraments would have never been needed. So he said, obviously, this is a wise and profound soul, and they have earned the right to stay here. So in the meantime, the Sikh goes out, and his fellow Sikh people come up to him and say, well, what happened? And he said, you know, I think that guy's really crazy. He told me that we're going to have a big argument, and if I win, we're allowed to stay. So first he says, you have to leave in 1 day. And I said, no, we're not moving until 3 days. And then he says, and then he says, but you've surrounded us. And the Sikh says, I don't care, we are staying. And then he goes out and he gets his lunch. So I go into my backpack and I took out my lunch. Okay, now I can feel comfortable and I can talk about God and infinite Christ consciousness. And, you know, it was very funny. Jyotish actually told us that joke at lunch, and he said, do you think we ought to tell, because they had agreed to have lunch with people from Palo Alto. It was very sweet. So then he said, do you think we ought to tell the whole group? And we all said, absolutely. I had actually missed the whole beginning of the joke, so I particularly wanted to hear it. But when I heard that joke, I thought, this is just so perfect for tomorrow, because it just so speaks to how confused we get, how we have no idea, how sure we are that we're right about what we're looking at, how stuck we are, really, in our own vision, our own framework, and how dramatically different truth can be. That's not what the joke says. They don't really say they're talking about truth, but it's applicable. It's just like that because there is a truth. And I mean, this whole reading that says, there was the light, and the light shineth, and the light became all that we see. But by and large, men can't see that. It's here, it's right in front of us. Truth is truth, but we don't see it. So we may as well be speaking sign language and misinterpreting everything. And yet, as that reading from the autobiography says, Sri Yukteswar himself said, no, this is incomprehensible. It's too hard for us. There's a wonderful story that Peggy Dietz tells in her book. Peggy Dietz was a very great devotee disciple of Yogananda's. And she lived long enough that Swamiji and other people knew her, and she wrote a book. So some of these stories we have heard. But in the book, she talks about one of the times when she went to see Master, might have been a very early time. She said she walks in, she's going to see this avatar, and an avatar, you know, like you walk up and you get to sit down and have a glass of wine with Jesus. It's no small thing. And she says in just a very short period of time, he takes out an album of pictures of his family, and he starts saying to her, look at my brother. Can you believe, he says, do you believe it? Doesn't he look exactly like Cary Grant? And for those of you that don't know, Cary Grant was a very well-known, very handsome, famous American movie star who was in movies from the 30s to the 60s. And here's Yogananda talking to her about how his brother looks like Cary Grant. And she said, I didn't know what to make of it. How can I relate to that? Are we talking about Christ consciousness, or are we talking about Hollywood? I mean, what are we doing? It just was meaning, she couldn't make sense. That's what it is. Swamiji has many stories where he says that, but in essence, he says, you would be with Yogananda, he knew every thought in your mind, he knew every thought in everyone's mind all over the universe, the globe, and then he'd be helping you dig ditches, or he'd be having a meal with you, or, you know, asking you to run an errand, or flying airplanes and playing a joke on you. It's just that play between the light that shineth, the infinite consciousness, and the way it manifests in everything. But as this reading from the Gita says so beautifully, I hope I get the words right, but that I manifest in a cosmic garment of my own Maya. So these great masters and great souls who come to teach us everything, but they're in these bodies, they're eating, they're sleeping, they're doing many things that we do. Cosmic garment of Maya. What a great phrase that is. So it's such a huge challenge to get from our mindset to truth, to being able, because, you know, John says it. John says the light's everywhere, but you can't see it. Well, you think, how are we going to get to see it? So I thought I would just share some stories today, because the moral of these stories are little nuggets that we can take away and ways that we can begin to practice. I mean, short of saying, again, I've said this so many times, what we always say, the true answer, the way to the light is through meditation. That is the ultimate goal, and it's the only way. Having said that, when we're not meditating 24/7 or even 18/7, because we're not, so all of the other time in our life, how will we get to experience God? I'd like to tell you 3 stories, a couple of which I've told many times. You've heard them, but the moral is so relevant here. The first story is the experience that I had years ago. I looked it up. It was about 8.5 years ago in Babaji's cave up at the meditation retreat. Somebody has actually dug a cave because Babaji lives in a cave in the Himalayas. They dug a meditation spot underground, no electricity down there, but it's very powerful. You walk down some steps and you're sitting there meditating, and I was doing that at one point. And I was actually thinking about what was coming up with the temple, all of the new classes, all of the work that was going to be going on, all of the transitions we were going through, because we were at the time. And in that very moment, I felt the masters very strongly in that cave. And what came to me was, there is a lot that will be going on, and a lot will be asked of many of you. But if you get confused, if you ever think that you are doing it yourself, and you feel overwhelmed or out of control, an experience that I could relate to, find the nearest altar, and we will remind you who's actually doing this, right? Because one thing for us to say, all the time we say, God is the doer, God is the doer, God is the doer. I have not met anybody who says, wow, I heard that phrase and that was it. My ego was gone. You know, it doesn't happen that way. It doesn't make sense to us that way. But finding the altar and this promise of being reminded when I was out of control served me, and honestly, it's probably served hundreds, because I've told this story so many times. Find the nearest altar. And then, years later, having an experience one time where I was going through something, having exactly that experience, and I said to myself, there's no altar here. Wherever I was, there wasn't an altar. It's unusual in my life, but it was true. And then it came to me, there's an altar in your heart. There is an altar, there is the altar in all of our hearts. So that message, go inside when you're feeling overwhelmed, out of control, stretched too far, when you're feeling anything that's taking you away from God, in fact. Just sit quietly and try and rest in your heart. Very good lesson. Then, many years ago, there was a woman. I was working at Kaiser in the urgent care clinic. A patient came in and she said to me, I saw you 2 years ago. And I said to myself, this is either going to be very good or very bad. You never know. What kind of an impression did I make on her 2 years ago? She said to me, she reminded me of the story. I didn't remember this story at all. She came in. She was a woman who had a high position. Now I don't even remember, with a hospital or doctor's offices, some big institution. And it was that time of the year where OSHA, which is the office of the government, I'm forgetting the words, I know James could tell me, but it doesn't matter, where they come in and they inspect everything. And I mean, I've been responsible for a couple of these. They come in with a fine-tooth comb, as the saying goes. They lift every paper. They're looking for not just really specks of dust, that's not what they're looking for, but mistakes in your books, in your policies. So it's a huge time of the year in a hospital or offices, wherever anybody is in medicine, where you get your act together. Because if you don't, the fines can be millions and millions of dollars, just even to correct them. The fines, and then you get a chance to correct them, then they come back. It's tension producing. So she was hysterical. She came wanting sleeping pills. And she said, I can't do this. I'm responsible for every single thing. And what if I fail and I can't keep track of it? She was like I'm feeling right now. That's how she was. So I said to her, why don't we calm down? Which irritated her. I knew right away it was such, and it was a mistake. You know, tell somebody who's hysterical to calm down. But I didn't learn at that first comment. So I started talking to her about meditation, about yoga, then I said, maybe you could just take a class in something that had nothing to do with anything spiritual, but that would make her more efficient. She was just furious with me. So finally I said, okay, we'll end the visit. I'll give you sleeping pills. Why don't you try and just every once in a while pay attention to your breath? Just stop when you're upset and watch yourself breathe. She left, upset. 2 years later, she comes back. She said, I've been wanting to write you for the longest time. She said, I was really upset with you when you left, and when I left. And she said, but I started watching my breath. And she said, within 1 week, I didn't have to take the sleeping pills. It's a very powerful story. So now we've talked about finding our heart and resting there, watching our breath with extraordinary transformation. We all know she's not the only person who's followed her breath and calmed herself in that way. Remember, what we're talking about is how can we begin to see the light? What can we use in our day-to-day life? And then I'll just share one other story with you. I remembered this last night, but I have no idea what this man's name is or what the name of the book is. But there was a book that, I think it was, the story was probably going around Ananda, of a man who had an experience, a 50-some-year-old man. His description was that he felt like it was a gunshot wound to his abdomen. But really what had happened is that he had perforated his stomach, I think it was, probably from an ulcer. It's not only an excruciatingly painful experience, but most people die pretty quickly from it. And he says that he had been an atheist, even the mention of God antagonized him. So he just didn't believe in anything, and he was terrified of death. Because if you don't believe in anything, when you die, that's the end of it. No more consciousness, no more fun, no more life, no more family, no more nothing. So he was terrified. So he said, I held on to life for 10 hours, but it was so painful, I finally had to just let go. And he was conscious of letting go. He said, but then I found myself in what I thought was the hospital, these long, dark corridors. He said, all of these people were around me. They were dark beings. They were gruff. They were mean. I thought they were the people who were going to be my surgeons. And I started getting really freaked. These people were awful. I didn't even like being near them, let alone going to surgery with them. And I said to them, no, I'm not going with you. And they said, you have no choice. They physically attacked me. He said it got very physical. He said they pulled my guts out. He describes it graphically in his book. And he said, while I was in the midst of this struggle, which I was losing, I heard a voice that said, call on God. And he said to himself in the midst of this struggle, I can't call on God. I don't even believe in God. But the voice said, call on God. He said, then I realized I didn't remember one prayer, not one prayer, but I was frantic. He said, so I started repeating the lines from Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, because it talks about God. The Gettysburg Address, because it talks about God. And he remembered then the 23rd Psalm. Anything, and then he remembered from his childhood the song, Jesus Loves Me, right? This sweet little song, this I know, 'cause the Bible tells me so. Very sweet, it's a children's song. He started repeating it over and over. He said suddenly, the tiniest thread of light came down, and from this light, Jesus was manifested. And there was Jesus, and he put his arms around me, and he held me to his chest, and suddenly I just sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And within minutes, I was completely healed. And Jesus started carrying me back up that shaft, little thread of light. And he said, I turned to Jesus, and he said, this is a mistake. I don't deserve this. And he said, Jesus looked at me with all the love I could ever imagine. And he said, we don't make mistakes. You know, it's such a beautiful story. So I'm actually running over here, but I just want to say, in these stories, we have 3 ways. So hopefully we are all meditating. We're all learning to meditate. There's so many ways to do that here. So many classes, people, ways to do it. Raja Yoga is about to start. If you haven't taken it, please do. I mean, just so many things you can do. But these other things that you can do, just hold your heart, even this. Just watch your breath. Just call on God. Jesus came all the way to this man. Imagine that. That was a true story. Of course, the struggle was going on in the astral plane. He thought it was in his body. But Jesus just came and saved him. Jesus came because he called on him. It's as simple as that. So take these stories, take these little lessons, bring them into your life, and then as life unfolds, before we know it, we really are, seeing God everywhere. We're feeling his presence. We're feeling his love. There's maybe not that direct route through our brains with our intelligence, but there is that direct route through our heart, through our breath, and through our love of God.